Hello everybody, this is Mr. Murdoch, and this is a video lecture on nutrition and metabolism. Nutrition and metabolism, this particular topic includes what happens to the nutrient molecules after they're absorbed. So in the previous chapter on digestion, we learned how the large food molecules are broken down into their individual nutrient molecules, such as glucose or amino acids or fatty acids, and then they're absorbed into the bloodstream or they're absorbed into the lymph, and then what happens to them? Well, it depends. And that whole story kind of encompasses this concept or this topic of metabolism. And this diagram here kind of shows us all of the what are known as metabolic pathways, or at least most of the metabolic pathways that kind of occur within a cell. And you see it's quite complex. That's one thing to note, and also notice that everything is kind of connected to everything else, and that one excess or deficit in one area of metabolism can have wide-ranging effects and affect a myriad of other reactions and products and processes and things of this nature. So metabolism, the nutrients in the food we eat, and what do we do with them, and that largely depends. So when people hear the word metabolism, they often think of situations or individuals with high metabolisms, such as this marathon race over here. Metabolisms are kind of revved up. Everyone's huffing and puffing. There's a lot of energy being spent. High metabolism. On the other end of this spectrum is kind of low metabolic rates, where things are a little more calm. And basically these chemical reactions here are just proceeding, you might say, at a slower pace. So slower metabolisms. Some individuals have a genetically high metabolism, and they tend to be thin and anxious and very active and motivated. Maybe they have trouble sleeping or relaxing. This is a high metabolic rate, a high level of energy moving through these people, hyperactive. People who suffer from low metabolic rates typically are not so thin. They're cooler in body temperature. They're calmer, not so motivated, not so thin, and they sleep a lot and maybe are a little less active. So at the other end of the spectrum, we have low metabolisms, and then there's a bunch of us, a bunch of people in the middle, in the varying degrees. So metabolisms can go up and down, and they're also somewhat genetically based. Metabolic reactions are often, at least many of them, are often compared to a fire, like a campfire, and we'll see how that comes into play later on. And it's a very accurate analogy, quite honestly, a very accurate comparison. The metabolic fire, so to speak. Note that in high metabolic states, there's a lot of heat being given off. Low metabolic states, less heat. And I don't know, it's high metabolic states, I guess. Ultimately, it all comes back to the food that we eat and what we use these nutrients for. This is metabolism. So the chemical reactions in the body used to generate and control energy. Metabolism, kind of a generic, broad scope definition. And here's kind of a breakdown of metabolism, kind of a very general breakdown. And over here on the left, we have nutrient molecules like proteins, carbohydrates, and lipids, as we've learned in the past. Those are the three nutrient molecules. And then here are their component parts. So these are the nutrients that they're broken down to. So proteins, follow the cursor here, proteins are broken down into amino acids. A lot of them, a bunch of them, and they're all collectively contained within what's known as the nutrient pool. Similarly, carbohydrates are broken down or catabolized to monosaccharides. And lipids are catabolized to fatty acids, basically kind of broken down. Catabolism means to break down or broken down. Now, in every instance, when a large molecule, like these large organic nutrient molecules, are broken down energy is released. Energy is released. And that's kind of a fact of nature, that when things, whatever they might be, are broken down, energy is released. When a building is broken down, it is released. Energy is released. When a dead organism is broken down, energy is released. On the other hand, once we get the nutrient molecules, they're all in our blood and within our bodies now, the amino acids and the monosaccharides and the fatty acids. What do we do with them? Oftentimes, we build them back up again. And when we take the individual amino acids and build them up, we put together proteins. And monosaccharides are built up or anabolized. Building up is anabolism. Monosaccharides undergo anabolism and become carbohydrates, polysaccharides, larger molecules. Similarly, fatty acids can be built up and they form lipids such as triglycerides. So conversely, then, when smaller molecules are built up into larger molecules, this process requires energy. So anabolism requires energy. These smaller molecules are not just going to bond together magically, coincidentally, into these larger molecules. That doesn't happen. We have to forcefully do that. We have to make that happen. Enzymes perform those reactions, but nonetheless, the reactions require energy. So sometimes this diagram is better viewed kind of as a circular or a cyclic diagram. Nutrient molecules are being broken down into the nutrient pool, and then all of these smaller molecules are being built up, and round we go. Digestion is a classic example of catabolism, and then bodybuilding or young children building up and getting larger, growing. This is excellent examples of anabolism. So anabolism or catabolism here, originally the image was posted to show anabolism. Anabolism is once again the building up, and this guy certainly is built up, particularly of protein. All that muscle and those tendons and ligaments are protein. So he's been building up a lot of protein, so that's anabolism, building them up from amino acids. He was drinking his amino acid shakes and building up proteins. On the other hand, as an afterthought, I noticed he's been catabolizing something as well. So what does it look to you that he's been breaking down quite a bit? In building up all that muscle, what looks to you like it's been broken down? Lipids, triglycerides. He doesn't have very much body fat, very lean, heavily defined musculature, lack of superficial lipids. So he's probably broken down all those lipids. He needed all that energy to build up those proteins. So it's actually both, I guess, anabolism and catabolism, depending on how you look at it. And then this one, I think, emphasize at least catabolism, or the breakdown. As we proceed from the top to the bottom, this guy is breaking down lipids. Whether he's working out or just not eating very much, the lipids are being used probably for energy, and less lipids. So catabolism, the breakdown of fat. So relating this a little more to digestion, there's two metabolic states. So the body operates in two modes, and the first mode, for example, is the absorptive state. And this is a period of time right after a meal, right after you eat, and all the nutrients are being absorbed into the blood, and that's what the body uses, is those nutrients that are right there straight from the meal. This is the absorptive state. Then there's the post-absorptive state, which I prefer to call the fasting state, and this is the period of time in between meals when there's really no nutrients are flooding in from the intestine, basically. So the intestine is kind of dry, or all the nutrients are empty from the previous meal, and a person doesn't die. They have some stored nutrients, particularly in the liver and certainly in fat, that the body can rely on. And this is the fasting state. And it typically might be a couple of hours, maybe, right before the next meal. Then you go into the absorptive state once you start to eat again. Maybe at like 5 in the morning or 6 in the morning, right before someone wakes up. They've been in the fasting state for the longest time, kind of through the night. or most of the night. Depends on when their last meal was. But that's typically when people are kind of in a fairly deep fasting state is early in the morning. Especially if you skip a meal, then you really have to rely on the stored nutrients. And don't forget, in nature, everybody, oftentimes we skipped meals. It's only a recent convenience that we have 3 square meals a day, sometimes 4 square meals a day with snacks. That's a modern phenomenon. In the vast majority of our historic past, we did go without food, certainly without a meal now and then, sometimes without food for days. So the body is perfectly capable of surviving in a fasting state for a while. You've got a lot of stored nutrients on board to get you through a tough time. And this shows kind of how things are absorbed. Glucose is absorbed, goes into the blood. Cells can use it for energy, or it can be stored in the liver. Triglycerides are absorbed into the blood. Ultimately, we know they kind of go through the lymph first, but once they're in the blood, they can be stored as triglycerides in adipose tissue, or used for energy. Glucose or fatty acids. Amino acids enter the blood and are used to build up protein. Or they can also be stored in the liver a little bit. So this is some basic biology review, that glucose supplies energy to make ATP. And that's what the cells ultimately use. So the body takes in glucose for energy. We know that by now. And what it does with that glucose is it breaks it down to make ATP. And that's what the cells use. The cells use ATP. They don't use the glucose directly. They use ATP directly. So the glucose has to be converted to ATP. That process, you should know, is called aerobic respiration. Then we can take a half step back. The ATP is then used for everything that the cell does. So ATP is the universal energy molecule for all cells. I think you know that. You should know that. And so no matter what's the job, what the cell's specific job is, or kind of these general jobs that cells have to do, ATP is what's used for energy. And here's a quick summary of how the ATP is produced. We see it's being produced over here on the right. This is aerobic respiration. It occurs in the organelle of the mitochondria. The glucose comes in from our gut, from our diet, or maybe stored glucose, but typically it's from our intestines and ready to use. We inhale oxygen, comes in through the respiratory system. Both of these molecules end up in the mitochondria, where they are involved in the chemical reactions where we break down the glucose. Catabolism is breaking down. We break down the glucose in the presence of oxygen, just like a campfire. Wood is really made out of glucose, so when you're burning wood with oxygen, that's like a campfire, the metabolic fire, and ultimately we get the heat. But more importantly, for the cell, we get 36 ATP molecules that the cell can use for energy. We exhale these carbon dioxides, and we get a little bit of metabolic water, which is not all that important. And the heat, certainly the heat. Whenever this occurs more, you get more heat. So when you start to run, when you start to breathe quicker, aerobic respiration, you give off more heat. And this is why. Or this is how the heat has evolved. A calorie is a unit of energy. And taking it to kind of a nutritional level, an adult needs about 2,000 to 2,500 calories per day. And that's probably a little to the high side, quite honestly. Maybe females 2,000, males 2,500 or less. For most people, of course, it depends on your size and your activity level. These are kind of averages, and they're a little to the high side. When they look at cultures that tend to live a long time, their average caloric intake is about 1,700. So 2,500 might be a little on the high side, unless unless you're really big, or tall, muscular, or you're very active, and you consume a lot of calories for your job or exercise regime, or sports, athletics. Maybe you're an avid gardener, it takes a lot of energy. The basal metabolic rate is how much energy an individual uses when they're resting. This is called the BMR, and you should know the BMR, what that means. It refers to a person's idling speed. How much energy are they using when they're just relaxed? Not necessarily sleeping. This is at rest, sitting down in a chair, relaxing, and it's typically about 70 calories per hour. That's an average. That's an average. So the BMR is typically measured by O2 consumption. So the faster you're breathing, the more energy you're using. And so typically people with high BMRs, like hyperthyroidism, they breathe a lot, they breathe fast, and they generate a lot of heat, and they have a lot of energy, and they never seem to gain a pound because they're constantly burning it up. High BMRs. Low BMRs, not breathing so quickly, more relaxed, calm, peaceful, sleepy almost, low basal metabolic rate. So here's the mitochondria, the organelle of aerobic respiration, and once again glucose and O2 coming in and ATP coming out, and then this is what the cell uses for energy. This is a lot of what your nutrients are involved in. This is pretty much solely what glucose is used for. Well, I take that back, a few other things, but certainly the primary function of glucose in the body is this. So that covers the bulk of carbohydrates, all those complex carbohydrates containing glucose. This is mainly what it's used for. Also takes a big chunk of the respiratory system. All the oxygen, which is, again, the main player of the respiratory system, is also involved in these processes. So these are key metabolic processes. Ultimately, we get ATP out of it, which leads to more metabolic processes because this is the energy molecule. You know, first things first, we have to get the energy first. So let's get into our first nutrient molecule and look at it a little more in depth. And we're talking here about carbohydrates and sugars. They're kind of the same thing. They certainly go together. You can view them as very similar or identical. They have maybe in common press, they have slightly different meanings, but they're very similar. And we're talking here about fruits and vegetables, as well as the grains and the starches, including breads and pastas and rices and potatoes. These are carbohydrates. The function of a carbohydrate, just to make it official, is a short-term energy supply. Okay, you eat carbohydrates for today, for energy for today, maybe tomorrow, but just the short term, a day or two down the line. Humans don't store that much carbohydrate. They can store a little to get us through, a day maybe, or to the next meal, but not much. And carbohydrates, when they're burned, every gram of carbohydrates gives you 4 calories of energy. 4 calories per gram. You can get carbohydrates in their complex form in wheat, rice, oats, corn, crackers, pasta, this sort of grains, polysaccharides. Also, they're found in fruits and vegetables. So very good sources of carbohydrates, fruits and vegetables. Carbon comes in rings, so they contain the C here standing for carbon. We've got a picture one there. There we go. So here's the ring. You kind of see a ring. It looks like a hexagon here. So this is a glucose ring. It's a carbon ring. Carbon, 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 carbon. There's an oxygen in there. A carbon ring for the most part. And one of these rings of carbon, sometimes there's just one. One of them is called a monosaccharide. One ring. Mono meaning one, saccharide referring to the sugary ring, a monosaccharide. So glucose, which is this molecule in the image, the diagram, is a monosaccharide, and so is another very important sugar called fructose. Slightly different molecular structure, but nonetheless a monosaccharide. Disaccharides are 2 of these rings bonded together, and we'll see a picture. Here we go. So we see 2 rings bonded together, and this is called a disaccharide. It's still kind of a small sugar, 2 rings bonded together. For example, sucrose, which the diagram shows down here, 2 rings. This is a glucose ring and a fructose ring. You bond them together and you get sucrose, and this is common table sugar. It's 1 glucose bonded to 1 fructose, making up a disaccharide, and when it's 1 glucose with 1 fructose, the disaccharide is called sucrose. If these happen to both be glucoses, a glucose bonded to a glucose, then that would be maltose. Maltose is 2 glucoses bonded together. Nonetheless, disaccharides are 2 carbon rings bonded together with an alpha-1,2 glycosidic bond, just for the record. Now, these carbohydrates are somewhat different. Polysaccharides are many rings bonded together, and let's just look at the picture real quick. You can see these individual little green hexagons are glucoses, and you see they're bonded together. So this is a polysaccharide. And when we looked here, when we talked about mono and disaccharides, it was 1 or 2 rings. These are what are typically known as the simple sugars, because they're simple. They're either 1 or 2 rings, and they taste sweet because they're small enough. This being 1 ring and this being 2 rings are kind of small. They're small enough to be received and detected by a taste bud. So they taste sweet. These molecules taste sweet. Polysaccharides don't taste sweet. For example, starch, like a potato or rice or pasta or corn. Starch doesn't really taste sweet. And the reason it doesn't taste sweet is because these, take a look here, these large chains of glucose, these are all glucoses, by the way, those hexagons, they're all bonded together. Sometimes the chain branches and sometimes it branches again, but nonetheless, they're all glucoses bonded together. This is glycogen. And it doesn't taste sweet at all, just like starch. None of these taste sweet because they're too big. They're such large molecules because they have all these glucoses bonded up. They're such large molecules that they taste, but they're too big to fit into a taste bud, and the taste bud doesn't receive them, the taste bud doesn't detect them, and you never essentially taste them. So typically you put butter or sour cream or ketchup or something on top of it to give it some flavor. But nonetheless, they're very sweet. They contain more. They're just sugars. They're sugar rings. So they're certainly sugars. They just don't taste sweet. Fiber's a little different. Fiber we can't digest. So this is cellulose is a polysaccharide, and that's found in plant cells. So notice this image only has things that come from plants. You can only get fiber from plants. It's made out of plant cell walls, and we need fiber to move through our digestive tract, the gut, the stomach, the intestines. And what the fiber does, we don't absorb it. It really is made up of nothing but glucose, but we cannot digest the glucose because of the bonding pattern. We don't have the enzyme to digest fiber. We don't have the enzyme to digest cellulose. So it goes through our digestive tract undigested. It goes out the back door, comes out with the feces, but along the way it scrapes the walls of the intestine clean. Kind of like a broom or a leaf rake. It scrapes and scrapes, and its rough texture, the roughage of carrots, the roughage of celery, in bread and pastas, that toughness that you have to chew, that's what keeps your digestive tract clean. Lack of fiber in the diet leads to things like constipation and bowel issues because the bowels can start to get clogged up with stuff. So it's a good thing to have a lot of fiber in your diet. The more the better, just about. It also fills you up, fills your belly up, and it doesn't provide any calories because you can't absorb it, because you can't digest it. It moves right through you in a good way. In a good way. Eat your fiber. Here's the difference between the three. All of these hexagons are glucoses. So you see starch, cellulose, glycogen is just nothing but glucoses. The difference is in the bonding pattern. Starch doesn't really branch very much. Cellulose has every other glucose is upside down, and in glycogen the glucose chains branch. But nonetheless, they're just different chains of glucose, polysaccharides. So take some time to get to understand how to read a nutrition label. We see here a potato has a lot of carbohydrates, but not that many sweet sugars. So most of the carbohydrates are polysaccharides, not so many sweet sugars. Here's how much of the 26 is fiber. If we look at an orange, it still has a fair amount of carbohydrates, but most of them come from sugars. So 19 total, but 14 come from the simple sugars, meaning mono or disaccharides. So the sugars are the sweet sugars, the 1 and the 2 rings. The rest of the carbohydrates are polysaccharides. They pull out the fiber because you really don't absorb that. And it's also good to know to see how much fiber is actually in the food. So both potatoes have a modest amount of fiber, as do oranges, because they're plant products. But when we look at the carbohydrate content is kind of similar, but where they come from is different. Here the carbohydrates do not come from sugars, meaning mono and disaccharides. The carbohydrates must mainly come from starch. Here the carbohydrates, 19 total, 14 of them come from sugars. That's a great deal of them, so that's why oranges taste sweeter. We look here at cheese. Cheese doesn't have any carbohydrates whatsoever. Doesn't have any fiber, doesn't have any sugars. Cheese is fat and protein. Fat and protein. So you should know how to read a nutrition label. Okay, get ready everybody. The liver can store and release glucose. Okay, and sometimes it has to store it, and sometimes it has to release it. If you have an excess amount of glucose, then the liver will store it. If the body is in need of glucose, then the liver will release it. It's kind of like saving for a rainy day. When we take the glucose and we save it, this is the red arrow, storing it, it's called glycogenesis. We take the glucose, we bond them up, and we make glycogen. Remember glycogen over here? Glycogen, we take our glucoses and we bond them up. This is the stored form of glucose. We just bond them up as glycogen. That's how an animal stores it, since humans are animals. We take the glucose, we bond them together, we make glycogen. There's the glycogen there. The opposite, see the blue, is in the fasting state is when we take the glycogen and we break it down into glucose so we can use them. Don't mind that green one just yet. That's called glycogenolysis. Taking the glycogen, see the glycogen word in there, and breaking it down. Lysis means to break down. So glycogen breaking, glycogen splitting. And that occurs in the fasting state when you're relying on the stored form of glucose. If you run out of glycogen, which glycogen can last you to the next meal or maybe to the next day, can't last you too long though. If you don't have glycogen, then you have to start to go to fat. No problem, except some organs don't like fat as an energy source, so when you take a fat, which is a non-carbohydrate, or you could also use protein, and you can convert it into glucose. Certain organs, like the brain, always need glucose. So if you run out of glycogen, you're going to have to make glucose from somewhere, and you can make it from a fat or a protein, and that process is called gluconeogenesis, when all the carbs are depleted, but you still need glucose. Where are you going to get it from? You're going to have to turn a fatty molecule or a protein molecule into it, because some organs, like the brain, and the brain's pretty important, they need glucose. So if you don't have any, you better make some. That's called gluconeogenesis. And that is described in this diagram in this area here. And we'll cover lipids and fats in our next metabolism and nutrition video lecture.